Ever dreamt of spending the holidays in a cozy English cottage? Well, since that's not possible, at least for me, I'm on a mission to infuse the timeless essence of a traditional English cottage into my own home this Christmas. And I'll be doing it on a budget, relying predominantly on thrift store finds. In today's video, I'll also be sharing my top tips and tricks to help you create a space with the same inviting warmth, nostalgia, and irresistible charm of an English cottage. So let's get started.
We have a new, very rambunctious puppy. So I decided this year I would put up only one tree, and I would put it in the front living room that has doors to keep him out. And since this room has plaid fabric wall covering and a very English aesthetic, I also decided to completely embrace a traditional English style while decorating this room for Christmas. Cottage style is a broad category that encompasses various styles, such as rustic cottage, farmhouse cottage, and beach cottage. However, I'm focusing on traditional English cottage, known for its patterned fabrics, vintage china, natural elements, and brass and copper accents. And in case you're interested to learn more, I'll point out the specific characteristics of English cottage design across the bottom of the screen throughout today's video. For a tree skirt, I chose a red velvety one that I made from a thrift store blanket in a previous video. I'll link that video in the description box if you'd like to see the tutorial. English cottage garlands are usually made by hand and are often made from popcorn or cranberries. My red bead garland looks like cranberries, but it's much less messy and lasts much longer. In fact, I've had these beads for years, although some Christmases I don't use them. When you're getting rid of some of your old Christmas decorations, I recommend that you keep those classic items that never go out of style. To decorate the tree, I chose classic ball ornaments in traditional colors, gold, red, and green. I also decided to add a few blue balls to coordinate with the walls and sofa in the room. I like to add one color or one type of ornament at a time to make sure that they're equally spread out on the tree. To identify genuine vintage and antique ornaments, examine the hanging hardware. Older ornaments have plain hardware made with heavy metal, and the hardware may be much smaller than that found on newer ornaments. In addition to the ball ornaments, I also thrifted this tartan plaid ribbon to use on the tree. In fact, this ribbon was the inspiration and the color guide for this room. And since there was no white in it, I didn't add any white ornaments to the tree. English cottage style became popular in the late 19th and early 20th century, and at that time, people decorated with many of the elements they found outside. I like to use fake berries and sticks from my yard to fill in empty spaces in the tree. I also like to tie ribbons to these stems rather than directly to the tree because then they are easy to remove after Christmas. Ribbon is the one thing that I will buy new every Christmas. Every once in a while, my Goodwill gets donations from Target, and I found this new plaid star that I thought would be a fun accent to my plaid ribbon. I also bought these gorgeous bird ornaments for 50% off at Hobby Lobby. Wildlife motifs such as birds, rabbits, and deer are very popular in cottage style. These birds are made of plastic, but they really do look like glass. And they have very strong clips on the bottom that hold them tightly, even on the tips of tree branches. I found two identical faux evergreen wreaths at Goodwill. The branches were really smashed, but the wreaths were good quality, so I thought $2.84 each was a really good deal. It took a while to fluff all the branches, but it made a huge difference. I replaced the ribbons with red velvet ones and then used some florist wire to add a few pine cones from my yard. Just cinch a little florist wire around the bottom section of the pine cone and then twist the wire around the metal wreath frame. Much easier than messing with hot glue. Hanging wreaths in windows, inside or out, is common in English cottage style, but I attached mine to the open shutters framing the tree. To decorate the fireplace mantle, I removed some dark metal decor and replaced it with a pair of brass deer that I thrifted a couple years ago. I dressed them up with some red velvet ribbon. I also added two other thrift store reindeer in the window. I plan on applying some rub and buff to them to give them a brass appearance. I thrifted this vintage spittoon for $5. It was really stained, disgusting really, but it was made from a combination of brass and copper, so I was hoping it would clean up. I made a paste of white vinegar and salt, spread it over the spittoon, and let it sit for an hour. Then I used a rag and scrubbed it off. Next, I spread some Brasso metal polish on it and rubbed that off. It still has stains, but it is much better. And if anyone knows a better way to clean brass and copper, please let me know. To use it as a decorative piece, I added some faux evergreens, berries, and pine cones, and then, of course, I finished it off with a velvet bow. Nutcrackers are so popular this year, but they're also a classic Christmas element. I thrifted this one for $4. His black hat and burgundy red jacket, I think, coordinate well with the fox hunting art on the mantle. Because this mantle is not very deep, I didn't have room to add an evergreen garland, so I decided to add this thrift store strand of faux berries instead. And I actually love how organic this looks. I still wanted some greenery on the fireplace, so I decided to add a garland below the mantle. This worked out nicely because one 6-foot garland was the perfect size. I just added small nails because this garland is pretty heavy and I wanted to add gold bells to one side too. I bought these bells a couple of years ago at Walmart. I like their traditional shape and color. And I do love the vintage looking bells that are popular right now, but because they're trendy, they'll quickly go out of style. I still had the second strand of berries, so I decided to layer them on top of the pine garland. And finally, to finish off the mantle, I added a bow to a candle ring and stuck the end of the florist wire in the pages of one of the books on the mantle so that it would hang down and look like a small wreath. One evergreen that is prominent in English cottage style that is often overlooked in Christmas decor is ivy. I pulled these faux ivy stems from a thrifted floral arrangement and just loosely stuck them in the pine garland. And I love how this looks, but I'm curious, what do you think? Yes or no on the ivy? In addition to the lights on the tree, I added this small lamp, which is quintessential English cottage. Soft lighting, aged brass, and a patterned shade with tassels. Next to the lamp, I placed a vintage Fitz and Floyd ceramic plaid box that I thrifted for a great price. I also added a small floral arrangement. Flowers played a significant role in traditional English Christmas decor, such as poinsettias, amaryllis, paper whites, and Christmas roses. I thrifted this lovely arrangement a few years ago, but it came in a modern white vase. But as luck would have it, I recently thrifted this brass vase for less than $3. The white vase fit inside perfectly. I may have to age the brass to make it look more vintage. I've shown how to do this in a previous video, and I'll link it in the description box if you want to see how to do that. As I arranged this tabletop decor, it became clear to me that this modern glass lamp had to go. So I headed to my basement storage room and pulled out a pair of black and red lamps that I had previously used in this room. As a bonus, these lamps have a red patterned lampshade. The first lamp harp that I tried was too tall. You could see the bottom portion of the harp. So I found a shorter harp, and then the shade came down lower. On the opposite side of the sofa, I was using this DIY cloche lamp, which I adore, but it too was too modern. So if you like either of these glass lamps, I've added them to my online store. For this tabletop, I added a small tree in a thrift store gold planter and a lovely ceramic owl that someone is selling for $75 online, but I bought mine at Goodwill for just a couple dollars. Don't you just love when you buy something just because you love it and then you find out that it's worth way more than you paid for it? I wanted to add some vintage china to the room, so I just put a candle and some greenery on top of this transferware saucer. Over the past few weeks, I've thrifted 3 different vintage brass angels. There's something very sweet about them, so I think I'm going to start collecting them. I also bought these little candles. Does anyone know what these candles are for or what the side of the box says? I melted a bit of wax into the candle cups because I thought these small candles would look much better than a full-size taper candle. Then I placed the angels on a shelf in the hutch of my desk next to some green vintage books. I also added a thrifted transferware bowl and, yes, another wreath. And in case you're counting, that's 4 wreaths in the living room. I always have vintage games sitting on the coffee table, so I just laid some mittens on top. The mittens were made from the same thrift store blanket as the tree skirt. I use a lot of small decorative boxes in my decor, which I needed to remove to make room for the Christmas decorations. But before I packed them away, I began wondering what people at the turn of the century would have done. And I decided that they would have added some greenery and bows and used them as additional Christmas decor. I'll show some more photos of the living room later in the video, but for now, let's move into the foyer. Although I'm still going to incorporate cottage elements, this area will reflect a less traditional take on cottage style. The vintage floral artwork is my inspiration for this room, and I'm decorating it in much the same way as I did last year. I added a glass pink tree and a floral arrangement in a brass bowl that I made last year. I also added another thrifted Fitz and Floyd ceramic box. Oddly enough, this box is more valuable than the one in the living room, but I paid even less for it. I started peeling off the label and almost forgot to take a picture of the price. Only $1.69. Everything on top of the cabinet was thrifted except for the pink glass tree and the candle ring that I wired to the front of the wood candelabra. I removed the orange bittersweet branches from the basket and added some snowy pine and magnolia stems, just tying on some pink and white satin ribbon. Left the needlepoint bell pull in the little alcove and just added a few small touches. This alcove is actually where a large chiming and very ugly doorbell once hung. To give a wintry feel to the magnolia wreath on the mirror, I added some pink eucalyptus stems, some ivy, and some pink flowers that I covered in iridescent glitter. The stairwell garland was still looking perfectly decorated from last year with ivory ribbons, vintage ornaments, and a few newer pink and blue ornaments. I just attached it to the banister with florist wire and then added in a few pink eucalyptus stems and ivy to coordinate with the wreath. The garland lights up and it just looks magical at night. My color inspiration for the family room was one of my favorite recent additions, the William Morris curtains. So no red or pink for this room. Instead, I would focus on greens, blues, and creamy whites. I started with the left side of the mantel, adding this thrift store evergreen wreath, and then trading out the candlesticks and tying on some green velvet bows. To the right side of the TV, I traded out a wood vase full of dried flowers for a $5 thrift store brass vase, and then added some greenery stems. I got a great deal on this angel candlestick, only $1.69. However, I thought adding a candle would cheapen it, so I used my angle grinder to saw off the candle cup. Now I think she looks like a vintage figurine next to my old books and picture frames. I was so excited when I found this metal log basket at Goodwill. At least I think it's a log basket. Please let me know if I'm wrong. Since I'm not putting up a full-size tree in the family room, I decided to add a small one to this basket. I bought this tree at Walmart a couple years ago. I added a couple books to the bottom so it would sit up higher, and then I staged my vintage copper scuttle next to it with some birch logs and greenery. I also added a metal bird and a bird's nest to the vignette. Next to the scuttle, I attached a small evergreen garland to the fire screen, also a thrift store find, and I attached some velvet ribbons and DIY bells. Finally, I added a strand of fairy lights that was long enough to wrap around both the tree and the garland. I staged this vintage leather trunk with a $3 thrift store Santa and swapped out the dried flowers in the faux antlers for some pine stems and pine cones. I also added this DIY cone tree that I made in a previous video from a Dollar Tree placemat. On the coffee table, I placed 3 older thrift store finds: a large brass candlestick, 2 small brass deer, and a gold metal reindeer planter. I added a candle ring in the reindeer planter and topped it with 2 felt floral picks. I have a sofa table in the back corner of the family room that is one of my favorite spots to decorate. It's also the first thing you see when you enter the room. The tall wood piece is off of an old piano. Several years ago, I traded with a friend. She got a wicker hamper, and I clearly got the better deal. More recently, I thrifted this solid wood goose for less than $4. And now he's ready for Christmas with his green velvet bow.